All right. Mic's on. It's a good start. Well, let me welcome everybody. I'm John Dickson. I'm our presenter today, tackling a particularly interesting and thorny issue about training of developers. And this is going to be a lot of fun. So 2 or 3 things. I'm going to rush through a bunch of numbers here. I'm going to jump into some of the very interesting things that came out to us in this survey. And I want to leave a good 10 minutes at the very end for questions and answers. So I know we got a bunch of friendly faces in the audience, and look forward to having some tough questions at the end. Okay, real quickly, my background, this is I think my 7th or 8th AppSec conference. This is, instead of a high school reunion, I go to AppSecUSA conferences and see all my friends from all over the world. So I've been one of these OWASP guys forever, and security professional, ISSA distinguished fellow. What I actually do in my day job, along with guys like Greg and others, is run the company. So this is the fun part of what I do. Day in, day out is I'm one of the business owners and leaders at Denim Group. And really what I do is I'm a dad, and I have a 7-week-old son back in San Antonio. And I'll just say my wife is particularly excited that I'm away for 3 days in New York. So with that, so she said, make it count, is what her encouragement was last night. So thank you, wife. Anyhow, so our background is we're one of these players, have been in OWASP world for a long time, doing application security services, software security services. One difference is we actually we do a lot of building and remediation around code too. So a lot of what we have learned about training and software development, software security is from our own teams. So out of our 90-odd folks, 60 of them are actual software developers and have come from that background. So as we delivered this particular survey, we learned things from our own team that we didn't really anticipate. So with that in mind, we'll get going. So what kind of got me inspired? For those that don't remember, Bruce Schneier, and that's a particularly ominous picture of Bruce for the record, he put out a blog post back in March that basically said, hey, you know what, user awareness training is just a vast waste of company resources. Pretty provocative. It said there's a bunch of other things we should do. We shouldn't leave it to the users, and that there's a lot of money spent at this. It's a feel-good activity, and yet no impact. Ira Winkler kind of tried to rebut that. But I read that from a different way. Not user awareness training, but more from the software development side and secure development side. We really couldn't answer that question. And so in the spirit of open and honest communication here, we're one of the vendors that actually does e-learning and classroom training for developers. And guess what we get asked frequently from our clients? What is the impact of your training so I can justify to my bosses? And guess what our answer was? I used to call this in the Air Force the 2-shoulder salute. I don't know. We really had no great answer. So this thing inspired us, and I said, this would be a fun thing to do. Here's the other thing that's very interesting from a vendor standpoint. We did not know the end results. So there was a lot of folks on our side in our internal team that said, hey, this may not be a great idea. We may get results back that are not particularly compelling as a vendor. So there's a little bit of background there that was just cautionary. So the other thing that we learned real quickly, just to distinguish user awareness training from software security or software development training, is there's a couple of key impact differences. Number one, they're both, I guess, trying to change behaviors, trying to change user behaviors and clicking on things, or the phishing attacks, or in the case of software developers, how software developers build code. Except there's a big difference, and I think all of us know this in the room. The software teams have the ultimate power. They have more power. They have more power to say no. They have more power to swing deadlines and release schedules in front of security folks. So I don't think general users can do that. But software teams frequently do that, where they say, hey, I'd love to do that, but you're going to have to catch me in February when we have the major release out. It happens all the time. So they use that, and that's just a reality. And they have, and because many of those features and functionality have been represented up to the business units or business unit, things, they have CFO and CEO visibility. So that's one thing. Here's the other thing that we know and have learned is that, even though it's infrequent, or should be more frequent, but it is infrequent. It's much more disruptive. So it's one thing to take, do a 15-minute snippet or video, or click on this link to learn a little bit more about phishing. Most of those general user awareness training are very small, and they're easily consumed in the course of a normal workday. The average class for general .NET and general Java security is 2 days for most vendors, 1 to 2 days. The typical course length of the similar e-learning is anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. So right off the bat, in order to program or to develop in a secure way, it's just a much bigger learning activity, right? And so, that's what the development managers understand, and they push back and they say, wait a second, I'd love to do this, but this is a project. And as a result, it makes it harder to do the training. But in spite of that fact, training is mandated. PCI DSS is probably the one example, and if you noticed the third bullet there, they've just added in the 3.0, hey, we need to go and find out whether or not these developers actually understand these concepts. And I know PCI is not a panacea, but for the record, and the other vendors know this, that the majority of purchasing of formalized secure development training is directly or indirectly driven from PCI. To put it another way, there's very little best practice purchasing of secure development training. Nice way to put it. Outside of NSA or outside of .mil or certain places. So here's the reality: is training is something that is a thing that we do. It's mandated by PCI. Training is a feel-good activity, right? To some degree, it's something that we can do. But here's the problem: the results are typically not measured, and that's not only the case with training for development and security and development, but also HR impact in general. So one of the things we learned throughout this process is that large-scale, change and training is just really rare, and being able to measure, even HR training, EEOC awareness training. There is a very tenuous line between training and impact, and across the board, and specifically in what we do, and that's the software security side of the house. On top of that, there's just really not a culture of measurement in this. So not only can our clients can't measure the impact, we can't measure it all. So the starting point for this entire discussion is virtually no data and virtually nothing. So here's the other thing that makes it interesting. As we went along, we recognized that some of these are statements of the obvious for us in here, but it bears repeating. Number one, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this career field, software development, is going to increase another 30% in the next 10 years. And most of those people, most of those new entrants are going to be not from this group, not from your current population of software developers. They're going to be net new folks, either primarily out of higher ed. So as a result, you're going to have, even if you solve the problem right now or do a scorched earth training policy, you're still going to, you're going to have the same problem 2 years from now. On top of that, this was the one that jumped out at me. I did not know this, is the turnover in our particular space is much worse than industry at large, which is about 14 to 15%. And then IT, a little bit more than that. But in software development, we know this anecdotally, and the statistics back this up, is that the churn is much greater. So you add the net new entrants and the churn, and you have a particularly interesting problem, which means if you, again, I use the scorched earth term, but if you really did a focused software security training initiative in 2014, if you look up in 2017, there's a very good chance that 50% of the people that you trained are no longer with the company. So that makes it very difficult. And and the other thing is business units, CEOs and CFOs are not looking to spend more money right now, right? What is the first thing that gets cut in a downturn for all those who were here in 2008? It's training budgets, right? So that's another challenge that exacerbates this problem. So turnover and growth make this a challenge. I won't talk about kind of how bad application security is and all that. The managers get that, we get that. So let's talk about the research itself, and I'll jump into the approach, how we tackled this, and then some of the results, some of which we felt were fairly straightforward, and others that jumped out at us as well. Number one, we really looked at software developers, and we were trying to find software developers that hadn't been trained on software security, greenfield developers. That was hard to do, first of all. It was not a particularly easy process. We also wanted to look at the reason why we wanted to look at greenfield developers or the unwashed masses is because we wanted to capture the before and after. We'll talk about that in a second, but basically we were trying to capture with the before group their awareness of software security concepts. Had they been exposed and did they understand basic concepts? And one thing we thought about, first of all, is maybe we could do a code snippet. That would probably be the best indicator of somebody's ability to understand these concepts. Is it before, here's a code snippet, and then after training, could they create code in a non-vulnerable way? Unfortunately, the realities of multiple platforms, multiple development languages makes that virtually just impractical, if not impossible. So instead what we did is we picked a set of questions that I'll show you that we think are representative. Like if you understand these questions, you will understand the concepts. So we interviewed about 600 software developers, some in person, some in classroom settings, some in online forums via the venerable SurveyMonkey. And we got a great smattering of vertical representation. Now there's some regional bias, and I'll grant you that. You'll see it in the numbers. We're based in San Antonio, Texas. I didn't mention that. So we're going to have a disproportional representation of energy. That's just, we're Texas. So some of that jumped out, and I'll show you where that did. And we also have a fair amount of public sector workers that were represented in here, more so than what we anticipated, and we'll see how that manifests itself. So we started this process probably early part of July. And the interesting thing is we did have classroom training environments. We had 3 big classroom training environments, so we got to actually talk to the people and interface with them. So there was a little bit of a personal touch to that as well. I didn't deliver the training, but our guys did. And for those that know Dan Cornell, our CTO, he actually did one of the training classes too. And a huge, interesting finding in one of those too. So here's our demographics. And again, we had 600 employees. We spent 600 developers. We spent a tremendous amount of time approaching groups, approaching companies. We put this out on social media. If you look at the far right area, most of them were software developers, but we did get a strong grouping of quality assurance and architects as well, and then a lot of others, people that I guess ambiguous in their career choice or identification, honestly, these are people that either were, software developers or went to software developer training, and maybe they just kind of got pulled in through. But we intentionally did not target security professionals, network security guys, project managers, and in spite of that, we still got this great representation of other. So I have a lot of empathy for the guys that actually, the political scientists that actually do samples, and these people that don't know whether or not terrorism is good or bad or other. There's this kind of funny things that come out in these particular ones. So this is So this is the thing that jumped out at me at first. We had what I would say a substantial representation of folks over 7 years. In retrospect, what we should have done is we should have broken it up another tranche of above 7 years. Obviously, we didn't want to ask how old they were because that shouldn't matter, although it's very interesting. There is a correlation there. But we had a vast majority of folks who had more than 7 years experience. We think that's colored by 2 reasons. Number one, I mentioned the regional bias for energy sector. Our observation is most software developers in the energy sector are much older than if you go to a startup in San Jose, they're all 22. If you go to some of the big oil companies in Houston, they're 42 or 52. That's just a fact. I mentioned the same thing with the public sector. And I've actually done speaking, as has Dan, in public sector environments. And I did a presentation in March in front of a very large state agency. And I was the youngest person in the group. And I'm 48, for the record. 48, and everybody was north of me. So I think that this is the thing that jumped out at me. Wait a second, we're continuing this survey, and we're going to target more of the technology firms and try to overcome some of that regional bias. But that was an interesting thing. We'll find out that didn't matter as much in the knowledge of software security terms and concepts. Okay, so here's the other thing. We tried to go get greenfield folks, but we ended up having, if you notice, there's, a big chunk had none, but we had a fair amount that had less than a day or 2 days. We had almost 100 that had over 3 days training. That was surprising. At some point in their career, cumulative had 3 days of software security training. The results don't reflect that. I'll just let you know that right now. So let me go back. Methodology, we picked 15 questions, and we did this peer review internally to the company, and we actually had a professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio that helped with this and provided oversight. We had a graduate assistant from the University of Texas at San Antonio that was a full-time worker on this for the last 5 months. So one thing I learned about this through this process is this is hard work and takes more than one guy to do part-time. But we picked these 15 questions and we vetted them. They targeted software developers and you distributed them, as I mentioned, online, hard copy versions. We had about 75 that we had a captive audience for in 3 different classroom settings, and found out some interesting things there too. And then we put it out on social media via Facebook and Twitter, and that's where we're going to probably double down afterwards to spend more time. And again, this is a very interesting results, but this, I think one of the things that will come out of this particular study is that there's need for more study. So here are our basic hypotheses going in. We had some inklings, but the first one was we felt, number one, that software developers still don't have a basic understanding of core software security concepts, AppSec concepts. Number two, that the software security training can actually improve, part of somebody's ability to understand and to deliver less vulnerable code. And then thirdly, this was one of my sub-hypotheses that actually was not borne out in our study, was that maybe the financial services guys have a head start. I mean, they're highly regulated. They have, we did not find that out to be the case. However, the sample size in the financial services was not what I wanted it to be. So there's an area going forward where we're going to spend some more time. So sample questions, again, these are representative of the types of questions that we would ask that like a basic person here should know. What is authentication? I would divide the questions into 2 areas. One, which is general AppSec awareness. What is a cross-site scripting error? And then the other half of what would you do to fix a cross-site, or to prevent cross-site scripting errors? So that was the thought. Again, awareness, and then more of the prescriptive or defensive coding ideas. So there's some odd results, and there's some real surprising ones. The first one is the very large organizations that we work with have the lowest secure coding knowledge. That might be turnover, that might be a variety of things. I will say the organizations that were represented in the study were not the banks and largest financial institutions. So I think if you threw some of them in, that would change that a little bit. So that was we looked at it 2 ways, by percentage of questions that were asked and by percentage of folks that passed. And we defined passing as 70%, which is a modest, a goal. Here's probably the first one that jumped out at me and our team is that, first of all, that architects, as you might imagine, have a pretty decent idea of software security concept, pretty good grasp. They were able to get percentage correct, 64%, and then vast majority, not vast majority, but they did pass. The QA guys, on the other hand, were on the other end of the spectrum. Software developers fell in the middle. So the real challenge with this is, and we've found this out talking to clients and kind of trying to socialize this after the survey, is number one, many organizations view QA as a starting point for developers. They'll put developers in out of college and they'll be working in QA for a while to work themselves up to the dev teams. We do that too at Denim Group. So that was interesting. But the challenge is that in many organizations, AppSec lives in QA, or at least they have a material role in the delivery of application security testing services. There's some role. So if they are less suited or understands concepts worse, that presents a challenge. So here is the other thing that jumped out at us, is that there was an awareness, a grasp of basic awareness of AppSec concepts. And 86% of the people understood what causes a cross-site scripting error. But almost across the board, they were ill-equipped, or they did not respond well to the prescriptive questions. How does one protect against a cross-site scripting error? So that's the gap, the real gap that jumped out, is and largely fell down on the defensive coding and prescriptive side, or how do you operationalize the AppSec concepts? It's great that you know them, but what we found throughout the studies was, and particularly with 1 or 2 questions, the hows and wherefores of fixing these problems they just bombed them. So here's the other interesting thing, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We surveyed roughly 600 folks. Out of that 600, we had over 100 that we didn't accept the results, or we considered throwing out. The reason for that is they did not complete one or more of the questions. So like what we found out from the survey and the political science world is that happens frequently. Is you're going to get a good 15 to 20% of your, they just get sample fatigue, or they don't fill it out for whatever reason. But the interesting thing is they did not fill out some of the harder questions. So if you throw in those as all not rights or all wrong answers, all these results get worse. So we just did not include those. That was our approach and the feedback that we got from the folks, the professors at the University of Texas. But if you were to throw those in, the results would even be gloomier. So that's an interesting. So they understood input validation. They understood certain things, but they got certain things about session ID correct. 88% of the folks did. There was still a big chunk of folks that had no exposure. So I mentioned that we did have 95 that had more than 3 days. That surprised us. A vast majority didn't. So this is one thing we know, and I know we've got professors in higher ed here. I recognize a few guests. At best, higher ed is teaching maybe one elective on secure development, and that elective probably deals with encryption for 2 or 3 months. I think Carnegie Mellon, a couple of Purdue probably has a little bit more in depth, but for the most part, the professors will tell you, what class do you want to throw overboard? Like I have them for really, 60 hours or whatever it is of electives, my junior and senior year. They have to learn about drivers. They have to learn about basic, compilers. So the challenge is they're not getting this. We know that. I sit on the industry advisory board for the University of Texas at San Antonio in their security group, and they have one class, and I think it's next spring they're teaching the first secure development class, which is not about encryption. It's about secure coding for the first time ever. So that'll be an interesting thing. So the kids coming out of school are not getting it. Here's the real big surprise, particularly in the over 7 years, is there really is no correlation between experience and knowledge of secure coding. And what this points to is a couple things. Number one, classic learning environments is you can't just do this once and then expect people to remember it 4 years from now. I mean, the proverbial learning curve, that does exist. So all those folks that had 3+ years training, they didn't blow the questions and answers away. So I mentioned that. But the good news is those that did have it 3 days or more at least got half the questions answered correctly. So there's some hope. But again, if you divide those questions out between the awareness and the prescriptive ones, that's a little bit sobering. So we're going to flesh that one out, but that was very interesting. Okay, so they know a little bit more about cross-site scripting after training. That's positive. That's good. And in general, the response were able to correctly identify what the concept of application security was after training. So so there is hope in that regard. And so across the board, we noted that retention was about 25%. Again, these were before and after. What we haven't been able to do is before and after, and 6 months after, and a year after. I think that's an area for future analysis. The good news is doing the before and after, we captured the contact's data. So we have their data, their personal data, not in a bad way, and we can go back and query them 6 months from now. So I mentioned we had about 600 respondents. We had to throw out about 100, and about 100 responded after as well, after some type of training. So interesting enough, there was a timing component to this survey. Like we had to catch companies and organizations that were just starting software security initiatives or conducting classroom training. That's why the numbers are a little bit lower. So there is some hope there. So here's some things that we also learned in this process that really jumped out at us. Again, we have the benefit of living in this industry. We do the classroom and e-learning training. But what we really learned, number one, is how different companies teach versus the way software developers learn. And ironically, as I said, we have a lot of software developers. So first of all, the way companies teach is they teach via a couple of ways. One is, formalized classroom training, or what's very popular now is CBT or e-learning or on-demand learning that you get a link and you click on it and there's some verification. The challenge is, well, first of all, you have to do that because if you're running a 1,000-person dev team, you can't just wing it, right? You have to have something that's measurable, as we discussed. But that's the way companies approach training. Okay, there's an e-learning vendor that does this. Bam, let's license it for 1,000 seats. Problem solved. So they kind of will acquire a technology, or they'll go and have classroom training. The unfortunate thing is, that's not how software developers learn. So again, when I say software developers learning, this is post-undergraduate training, right? So everybody's been to college, most people have a CS degree, and from the point they graduate onward, virtually everything is informal. So what we learned, and we really this is an area for even further discussion, is how these folks learn. They don't go to classroom training anymore. They don't go and love e-learning as they just don't. And to some degree, this is how they learn. Like they pick up, everybody that's learned Android or iOS, they didn't go to like a 4-day iOS class to pick up this, or that they're learning, a new language, Ruby, or a new framework. They don't go to like a 4-day class off to a class. They learn quickly, they learn informally, they learn through social networks, they learn by doing. And that is a big, big point. If you are in the unenviable or enviable position of rolling out one of these programs, you have to take that into consideration. Morphing a little bit of what the formal structure for training and actually kind of adapt it to the way developers learn. Here's the other thing. This is basic stuff, but don't forget basic learning curve issues. And the bottom line is, if you teach and then 4 years later expect the folks to remember it, they will not. You have to have some kind of refresher, usually in bite-sized bits, security awareness, maybe driven by one of the dev team leads or by the software security lead. Taking what we've seen as a best practice is taking real stories that, hey, this breach happened, what are the lessons learned and how is that important to us? Those kind of real learning situations are fantastic. I've seen the best companies have figured out how to get it in the developers' performance plans, where they say, hey, that's how they're held accountable. Like if you're asking me to take 8 hours of training and I'm not rewarded for that, like this is just like something I got to do, But if I've seen the sophisticated organizations put that as some kind of MBO or some type of learning goal for the year. Hey, you have to do this and understand it. And then again, be ready to answer the ROI question, even if it's intangible. Because that's the way the world works. Post 2008, managers are not looking to spend more money. They're looking to say, here's $100,000 to do training. Show me how that per lines of code we are more secure, or lack of vulnerabilities, lack of breaches. So that's an important thing. The other thing I would throw in there is incentives matter. And if you don't think they do. They do. We did this classroom training, 75 students. We had 25 fully completed surveys before and after. And I was completely at my wit's end. So captive audience, kind of like y'all, we sat down before the training. Here you go, fill these out. We didn't have any incentives. We should have. We should have said, hey, here's your iPod, or here's something at the end of the class. We did it afterwards. We did 3 classes back to back to back. Out of 75 students, we got 25 completed before and afters. Either they just didn't do the after, or they did part of it, or they didn't, So that was shocking to us. And the same thing bore out in the SurveyMonkey things that we'd send out to organizations, and we'd get like a chunk of them back. Like you just, and again, factor in the not knowing component. So what we ended up doing at the very end is we wanted to get more financial services and more representation outside of our backyard. So we did the social media deal. We did that for a while, and then we threw a $100 Amazon card on it. And virtually every survey from that point forward was filled out completely. And if you think you're above that, I would just point out, for those that are going trick-or-treating, we're to some degree this stuff works. And absent of it in your programs, you will probably you'll be surprised, like we were surprised. So again, captive audiences, you have to have something, even if it's kind of silly and kind of superficial and like swag at a trade show. It actually works. Okay, so the conclusions to open up time for questions and answers is, number one, the software developers still do not largely understand key software security concepts. With the definition of 70% is passing, 73% failed. However, software developers' understanding of key software security concepts actually got better, roughly 25%. The key question will be down the line and when they change into different frameworks and do whatever. So that there is an impact. To put it another way, the utter absence of this training is probably going to produce the results that we can anticipate. So where do we go from here? There's two things that we plan to do after this. This has been a major effort, bigger than what we thought for an OWASP AppSec presentation. I'll just leave it at that. We want to do two things. Number one, we want to keep the survey going. I want to spend more time with and tease out more information from the financial sector. I think we're underrepresented there. Get rid of a little bit of the geographic bias. And the second thing is we're going to publish this in the form of a white paper later this year when I can finally write it up. The survey component of this took a tremendous amount of activity. And like I said, we had a full-time graduate assistant. I'm not sure we're going to have the appetite to do another survey for the 2014 AppSec, but it was very interesting. And the results, we're doing secondary analysis as another component of this. The one thing that we're trying to figure out is, like, you throw out the over 7 years of folks, there's some interesting things. And if we do this again, we'll do it so we can break up that over 7 years group and know a little bit more about that. That was probably the grouping of that survey class was not, turned out to be less than fantastic. So with that, I've got substantial time for questions and answers, which I suspect, well, I hope we have. Yes, sir.
On one slide, you had people who had 0 training versus 3 days of training in the past, what percentage passed and didn't pass.
Yeah.
It was like, there's only a 4% difference between no training and 3 days of training in the past.
I think that's a retention. It points to the retention is what we think. That's our initial analysis of it, is the retention issue. So, like, you've had 3 days of training. What we didn't ask is how long ago was that?
Yeah, that's where.
And again, and then the other one is, like, was that the architects that answered that question or the general devs? So there is so much data here. So part of it is we want to expose this and get it out there, because you're right, there's so many secondary questions. I think, like I said, the over 7 years thing jumped out at me immediately, and I have the anecdotal experience of having trained some of the, I just come off of a training session with the state government where literally I walked in and I'm the youngest guy there. I was like, wow. And then, and versus our group where they're all 22, and they call me sir and dad, or kind of, they could be my children. But that's a huge eye opener, and I think that's the case in the energy sector. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. Is that if you go to Houston or go to big oil services companies, or the big upstream guys, the developers are just older, at least in their late 30s, probably. Yeah, you start in the back. Okay, either or in the front.
I volunteer at a forum, and one of the things I see is people who are either learning from books or work for small companies that can't afford training are still not aware that SQL injection even exists. Do you have any suggestions on how to go about educating people like that?
Well, what we've seen that's successful is you get the one person, that dev team, that kind of understands security, and you let that person teach the rest. I mean, I think Brad Arkin and the guys at Adobe have done a good job of figuring out who within the dev teams are the actual entry points. But some example like that. The irony of all this is that, as a security person, you can't mandate the dev teams do this. So you kind of have to sell them on the concept of doing this to some degree. And if there is no top-down imperative to do it, then finding that person on the dev team that kind of took that one class and loves cryptography or whatever, you get that person and leverage them, is what I've seen to be successful in non-regulated, non-compliance environments. So again, I've said this before publicly. You wake up and we realize we're actually in sales and marketing to the dev teams, and that is the irony for what we do. So, yes, sir.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on taking this a step further and looking at how specific developers are trained and tying back the training improvements to their code quality? So, for example, they start at point A and we know that we have security issues and software programs that they're responsible for, and then tracking over time how they might improve based on the training initiatives.
So this is such, I'm not going to quit my day job and go work for a polling company, right? But what we learned real quickly is and when we did background research, and again, I had a graduate assistant and I did peer review with a professor, there's just a dearth of information on this topic, period. So one of the outcomes we have is like, what's the next set of studies? And absent of incentives, you're not going to get developers. If developers don't like formalized training, they sure as heck don't like doing surveys. That's the other thing I would throw in there. So like, how do you study a group of folks? This is almost like a sociology project. A group that comes in and here they are. Here's your dev team in 2013. What do they look like 4 years from now? What's the turnover? Do they get these concepts? But I've found that it has to be current, it has to be relevant, interesting, and emphasized throughout. So the answer is there's so many different vectors that we could take off of this. For those that are interested, email me or send me a Twitter DM. And but one of the assumptions going forward is that I will probably look for another graduate assistant. There's a lot of work behind this, and again, Gartner's they're not worried about losing their day jobs either. I mean, surveying and interviewing is an intensive process, and also is frustrating when you realize, like, we had 75 students that were a captive audience for 2 days, and they didn't, 2/3 of them didn't fill out the surveys. Like, what happened? So a lot of work to come out of this. I think a lot more ideas. We're hoping to tease those out in the white paper. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Are there any plans to maybe expand your survey question? Because it seemed like you're saying your whole survey was based on security-related questions. And I know you have the demographic of how much experience developers had, but did you try to do any baseline to correlate their results on security-related questions versus results on average development questions?
Okay, so that's a good point. And the other thing is the feedback we've gotten is you need to also consider the general way people learn and look at the difference in that. I would say two things. First of all, we didn't ask security questions per se. We asked questions on secure development concepts and then how to implement those in coding. And so there were questions that we had originally had, like, what's your awareness of HIPAA and things. So all those kind of like general security stuff we threw out. It's really for developers in that. The answer is that we could probably get better sets of questions, or code snippets are probably the best way. But language dependencies and framework dependencies and all that are just too much of a challenge. I will gladly share the actual questions with everybody and the data. So again, email me or DM me or give me a card. But the 15 questions are pretty ones that we should at least get, I would think in this group, 90% correct. A good 12 or 13 out of 15. They're basic ones that even non-developers could probably get. If you did the CISSP or the CSSLP, which doesn't mean you have to know anything about secure coding, you can read about it, you could probably pass this. So you don't have to actually be an AppSec guru or a coder. You just have to be able to mouth the words. And what we're saying is the developers could not mouth the words. So there's a lot. Again, a lot of follow-up on this. This kicks open the can of worms in a way that we didn't fully understand either. Yes, sir.
Hitting on your topic of getting the developers to do this, in my company we found that in addition to the time, they view it as a compliance thing that they have to get checked off. And so they see it as something that takes them away from their job of developing. And so that's a huge hurdle to overcome. But when we've gotten them in the room and show them how a SQL injection vulnerability, and then you can own the database, and their jaws drop and the light goes on, then they start to get it. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with that?
Well, number one thing we did confirm is it does take them away from their day job, right? Versus the 15-minute snippet for security awareness. It's 8 hours or 2 days. That's different. Again, absent of compliance or top-down imperative, you have got to, essentially get them on board and train them. And that the way that I've seen it best done is do brown bag entertainment thing. You're going to get the people that care are going to come to the brown bag, and then you pick them off as your local ombudsman or your local point of contact.
So bring free pizza or something.
Free
right?
pizza, a beer, bribery, incentives. Again, if they don't view this to be central to their role, now that's changing, and I think in financial services and banks that this is central to what they do. There is a vast gap between the way the big banks do things and the way the big manufacturing companies do things in the software security world.
And so it sounds like you're kind of also saying engaging top management.
Well, okay,
least-
so
at
let
least
me
from
give
the
you a great
CIO
example.
level.
And this is a war story that Dan Cornell tells all the time. He did training at one of the major airlines, and I won't say which one, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and nobody told them why they were there. So we had 25 people, and we did like 6 days in a row, and the first day they're like, why are we here? And so all why? I just got this meeting request in Outlook, showed up, it's a training day. It's the equivalent of going to the zoo or having a day off. Like I'm in training, entertain me, I'm doing my work. And what Dan did is throughout the day scared them progressively enough so they did pay attention. This is opposed to another environment, a retail environment where the CFO had for the Fortune 500 company, recorded a little snippet of him saying, this is why this is important for all of y'all. We hold precious customer data. You saw what happened at this company, you saw what happened at this company. We don't want that to happen with our company. Pay attention, this is important to me and important to our company. That little step got them to turn on. So those are little guerrilla marketing tactics that you have to do. Invoking the CFO. You can't do that. CFO can do that. They won't pay attention if you do it. Here's a security guy saying, pay attention. Who cares? I don't even know his name. But the CFO will get that attention. So that was kind of a cool way to leverage that.
Okay. So I agreed with your slide where you're talking about how the short snippets work and the less than 15 minutes, whether it be social media or blogs, and that the long online courses just aren't effective at learning. Yeah. Yet, how do you deal with the management concept, though, that they need compliance? So how do you track 15 minutes that seem to be optional? Do you make those mandatory? Or are auditors satisfied with many different blends of how you're educating your users?
So again, the focus of this was the study and survey itself, but I think what it points to are things like not making people do training just for training's sake. So I'll give you a great example, is sending out a screening pre-quiz. If you pass it, you don't have to go back and take the module. Well, guess what? 30% of people pass it, they don't have to take that. That's a cool way of doing it, so that or maybe even mention that when you do the training that, hey, we're going to quiz you in July, and if you remember this stuff and pass it, you don't ever have to look at this again. So that's one way to do it, but there is no great. This is not a e-learning or training strategy presentation, but what I'm telling you is if you do it and just release e-learning out there or make people go to classroom training, don't expect the results to be linear. You have to cast it through the lens that developers train, and that might mean breaking it up and make it harder. It will be harder to do that tracking and all that. It's not easy. But the results are is if you, and all the vendors that do this that are in here that roll out e-learning, you turn it on, there's not like some rush for all the developers to consume it, So we've seen, it's like, wait, nobody's logged in. We knew that was going to be the case. So it has to be in concert with some kind of awareness event, some kind of incentive, getting a dev manager on board who can say, hey, I just took this, is pretty cool. And, when we built this app 2 weeks ago, blah, 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 making it personal, making it come from the dev side, if that makes sense. So there's no great answers, but this further, I think, cements the point that you cannot just do the stock answer of formalized training. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to add to that, what we do where I work is developers don't want to get a 3-hour training all at once and have everything thrown at them. They don't retain it. You got to kind of take a risk-based approach and say, do I really care about log foraging if you have SQL injection? Do I really care about a cookie being set secure when you've got parameter tampering? Those are the things you have to focus on. And so instead of just setting like a 1-day, 2-day training, we'll do like an hour and a half on SQL injection, cross-site scripting, parameter tampering. Make sure they've got those, then we'll work on the other stuff. But if you've got those main ones, those are the ones that you can really show. With SQL injection, you can own the database, which you can do with it, and do demos for them. They retain that a lot better.
I found that, to answer the previous question, another interesting thing is you pick one example from the dev team. So if you don't do that, they will view the threat as abstract, or the risk as abstract. But if you pick one app and say, for example, and then suddenly everybody swivels and they're like, oh, okay. So I think that's another emerging best practice is don't just train them, but build a little bit of time or resources in there to pick an app that maybe the pen test just blew up or that you just scanned and show them how this manifests itself.
And when we scare them, we grab headlines and say, look at this company, one of our competitors, they were hacked. We don't want our name there.
And then that's what the real successful guys are able to take those stories and not just scare people, not just forward links, but just say, here's why this is what the impact was on that particular thing, and here's where we think our risk is or the impact to us. If you can tell that story through that lens, it's much more powerful, I found.
Any more questions?
All righty. Thanks for your time, and like I said, I'll hang around.